So as I mentioned, the subject that I want to talk tonight on or focus on is education. So I'd like to talk about the importance of education and its in terms of its purpose and effect in a broader, more conceptual sense, exploring some of the philosophical underpinnings. Is that a little better? Is this mic working? I don't know. It's not working. I don't know if I turn it on or off. Anyway, okay. Oh, is there? Don't mind me if I do something there. Oh. And power on. There you go. That always helps. Does that help? Well, now we've done it. Okay. How about that? Is that better? Okay. I can hear myself. And the voices aren't coming from inside now either. That's that's great. Okay. So, as I said, any discussion on our school, which we're engaged in at the moment, it does relate to new church education in general. So, as I mentioned, I'd like to talk about education and explore some of the philosophical underpinnings of classical education, which I believe applies as a model to new church education, and compare that to education in the current public domain, which I think is no longer classical but is rather rooted in modernist or even postmodernist ideology. So I'm going to get into those terms a little bit later as we move along. But looking at education in this way, I hope to explore an understanding of education as a systematic pursuit designed and undertaken to accomplish specific aims, not just for the student, but also for the wider community and society as a whole. And lastly, I'd like to get into briefly how and why the function of education, or more precisely the aims of education, may have changed over time. So I got to do a little bit of technical stuff here. All right. Oh.
Go ahead and start talking. Let me just listen to that.
Okay, so here comes the standard disclaimer. So the opinions expressed are entirely my own and are not necessarily shared or reflected of the church or the school's organizations. They're just my own personal thoughts and musings on the subject.
Is that coming out still okay? There's a little bit of a ring behind it before.
Standing further back.
Oh, is that still on? Yeah? Okay. Okay. Great on. Right on. See, we just keep getting closer and closer to the mark. Okay. Yeah, he can be taught. Great. Okay. So education, to be frank, is a rather mundane topic. So we were all educated to one degree or another, mostly within some system that was set up precisely for that purpose. So universal education was not always the case. But most of, not all of us, right up to our youth and early adulthood, could say that our lives were inextricably interwoven with the school. So education as a personal and collective undertaking is, by and large, very ordinary across all times and cultures, from Plato's Academy, founded in 387 BC, to the timeless storytelling of traditional societies, which is, I believe, a form of education, right up to the institutions of basic and higher learning that characterize our own place and time. So to begin with, I'd like to quote a comment I recall from an old TV series which explored traditional cultures. So this series aired decades ago, maybe in the 1970s. There we go. So paraphrasing it as best as I can remember, and to be quite honest, I don't remember a whole lot from the 1970s. But I do remember hearing this, that the point was made in relation to education in those traditional social structures, that the questions that one asks are important. But just as important, and maybe more important, is who answers them. So in other words, education, the preservation and sharing of truth, both sacred and practical, the sapientia and the scientia, which we'll get back to, our terms we'll get back to in a moment, was the primary means of enculturation. This may have been more evident in the simpler structures of traditional societies, but enculturation, for better or worse, is also a feature of what education is all about in our own place and time. This is an important point. Education as enculturation. We know the etymological derivation of the English word education as a common noun, and to educate as the associated verb, which comes from a group of Latin words, principally educare, e plus duco. The term e means out of, and duco means to lead, from which, by the way, we get the aristocratic title of duke, which means leader. So according to the meaning of the word, to educate someone or to be educated is to lead someone out or be led out by someone. So we might ask, out of what? So we can easily name ignorance. As human beings are born, at least in relation to the natural world, as a kind of tabula rasa, a blank slate as it were, essentially not knowing anything, at least in their relation to their material environment. And Swedenborg discusses this condition. So we could debate about what he says, but I think by and large the overall empirical evidence suggests that we can safely accept the general idea as true. We can also ask the question, into what? If education is to lead out, then what precisely are we being led into when we're being educated? So here's a statement that I would like you to think about as we move through this subject. I'll just click here. Okay. So education traditionally is the means of leading and introducing the new generation into established society and culture. That is, ways and modes of exercising their humanity, bequeathed to the young as an inheritance or heritage by pre-existing generations, according to the manner in which the collective past generations best understood divine purpose and meaning evident in the world, and had developed the society and culture to reflect those beliefs. A practical illustration of this phenomena is from a primer on spelling and grammar, which was used by elementary school students in Puritan New England in the early 19th century. School children were taught the 3 R's. And I think whoever coined that phrase must have had a real frontier sense of humor. Reading, writing, and arithmetic. And they learned to read by use of the Bible and other religious texts as a source, which is not surprising. But it is often commented on that the Puritan educational materials for young children were particularly morbid. So here's a simple example. Life and the grave, 2 different lessons give. Life teaches how to die, and death teaches how to live. Those are for little kids. So that's from, I think, 1811. So the Puritan primer is rife with references to death, dying, and the fragility of life in a way that might make us believe that those people in that place and time were morbidly obsessed with death. So here's a little representation of the alphabet, and when he gets to X, it's Xerxes the Great did die, and so must you and I. And there are other sort of similarly toned little quips for each of the letters. So, but we might be tempted to rationally attribute this obsession with their religion. But when you realize that in early colonial North America, lifespans were low, infant mortality was high, often including the death of the mother in labor. Frontier medicine was crude and usually not available. We can understand why death was a subject that could not be avoided. In those communities, the likelihood was high that before you were even out of your teens, you would experience the death of your parents, aunts, uncles, even siblings. And death wasn't the antiseptic clinical experience we might associate with hospice stays and closed casket funerals in special homes that we have today. The deceased were often laid out on the kitchen table. Burials of close family members and neighbors were in the ground adjacent to the church that you went to every week. In that reality, the experience of death was a frequent event that everyone had to be prepared for. So the children were taught about it as part of their education, as a means of enculturating them to the inevitable reality that they were sure to face. This is another little poem from there which I couldn't resist sharing with you. I, in the burying place, may see graves shorter than I. Let's flip the page here. From death's arrest, no age is free. Young children too may die. My God, may such an awful sight, awakening be to me. Oh, that by early grace I might, for death prepared be. In most classical and traditional societies, from the Egyptians to the Puritans, even, or better said, especially, death, when and how to deal with it, was incorporated into the culture, into the perception of, according to the perception of the divine purpose and meaning that could be inferred from the world around them. The equation of education with enculturation is not limited to myth and ritual of ancient and traditional societies or the hardship of frontier life. As Edmund Burke observed, commenting on the 18th century French Revolution, and this is a quote from Burke, "Society is a partnership in all science, a partnership in all art, a partnership in every virtue and in all perfection. As the ends of such a partnership cannot be obtained in many generations, it becomes a partnership not only between those who are living, but between those who are living, those who are dead, and those who are to be born." I suggest that education, traditionally speaking, was the means of cementing, celebrating, and continuing that partnership. So now I'm quoting from Burke here, a classical conservative. If I wanted to take the position that elements of the wider culture, norms, and traditions in society are like a straitjacket on individual freedom that need to be thrown off, I would have quoted John Stuart Mill when he asserted that the despotism of custom is everywhere the standing hindrance to human advancement, or that the relationship between the individual and society is only active or relevant when the preferably narrow overlapping interests of both parties can be determined and agreed to. As Mill states, the individual is not accountable to society for his actions, insofar as these concern the interests of no person but himself. So that's pretty classic liberalism. Obviously, contrasting Burke, the classical conservative, and Mill, the classical liberal, sets up a dichotomy of mutually exclusive perspectives, which present a watershed between the classical and the modernist worldviews. For my purposes, or for me, I equate Burke with a classical vision of society and see Mill as a reflection of the modernist vision. For myself, and myself only, I do tend to think that comparing these notions, even allowing for the necessity of individual freedom in act and conscience, with the writings, would generally tend to be more favorable to Burke or the classical ideal. That's just my opinion. I say this because it seems to me that individual freedom, though carefully preserved by the Lord, is provided as a means toward an end. And that end is the establishment of a harmonious whole. Humans are given the faculties of liberty and rationality to act in freedom according to conscience. This is true in effect, but we know that we are by the Lord in a carefully managed equilibrium between good and evil influences, heaven and hell, that allows the perception and feeling of freedom. But it is, in fact, a functional illusion, more apparent than real. We can also consider that faculties and capacities, even the faculties of liberty and rationality that comprise the mind, are means to achieve a purpose or an end, not the ends in and of themselves. So stating it this way, the primacy of love, which is the essence of community and society, over freedom, which is a feature capacity of the individual, becomes clear. The modernist obsession with personal freedom and the notion of the sovereign individual is important, but belongs to the as-if from self paradigm that Swedenborg deals with at great length in many contexts, but without the as-if part of the equation. Freedom is not an end, is an indispensable prerequisite for a higher end, which is society. In other words, without freedom, love could not achieve its ends. And without love, freedom just wouldn't exist. To obsess about freedom and not see what is beyond freedom or what it's for is to give primacy to means and methods, without seeing the aim that those means and methods were provided for and employed to achieve. Where we fall in the debate over the role of freedom, whether it is as a means or an end, a means to an end or an end in itself, is a good indicator as to our predilection towards a classical or a modernist worldview. Burke's reference to society as a partnership in every virtue and perception, in every virtue and perfection across generations implies contiguous culture, that is, settled moral and ethical paradigms, implicit prohibitions or taboos, venerated traditions, fidelity to language as the preservation of meaning, love of country or land and community, love of the neighbor, those with whom you share a common affectional bond for what is inherently or commonly good, the commonweal. In short, society is a rubric of kinetic forces arising from the understanding of divine purpose and meaning represented in the world, exemplified or mirrored in thought and useful behavior, encouraged by education that brings about the harmonious reciprocity of the individual within the whole of society and the whole of society within the individual. In this reciprocity, it's hard to find where the interests of the person and the interests of the society can be separated or limited by narrow definitions of scope of what is properly exclusive to one and not the other. That the interests of the whole of society and its parts, i.e., identifiable individuals, are so intertwined as to be indistinguishable is apparent from the fact that they do not have separate sources or causes. The Lord is the active cause and the continuing source of both. So we can look into Swedenborg's comments on the nature of angelic societies in Divine Love and Wisdom, where he states that when everyone performs their service, rightly, honestly, justly, the whole is maintained in the common good, and this is what it is to be in the Lord, since everything that flows in from the Lord is a useful endeavor, which flows from the parts into the whole, and from the whole into the parts. The parts there are the angels, and the whole is the society in which they live. This paradigm is the foundation of the classical view of the world. Education in that worldview takes on a clearly identifiable character. Specifically, that it is the responsibility of each person to understand the divine meaning and purpose represented in the world and to conform our affections and intentions through useful service so as not to be opposed to it or to act against it. For this part of my talk tonight, I have borrowed heavily from C.S. Lewis's essay on education written in 1944 and various commentaries about it. Lewis's essay, entitled The Abolition of Man, starts by dissecting and criticizing a textbook produced for English school children in the upper forms called The Control of Language, a critical approach to reading and writing, which was written in 1939. For Lewis, a proponent of the classical worldview, this textbook for young minds in the grip of the British school system was a clear representative example of faulty modernist ideology. Lewis's issue, as one commentator noted, was that the control of language presented itself to be an English textbook, but it really taught very little English at all. Instead, it taught philosophy in the guise of literary criticism, and not only philosophy, but bad philosophy. By means of the control of language, students were compelled to adopt a moral relativism and subjectivity in the name of not being taken in by statements of feeling or value, which have no place in the materialistic naturalism of the modernist worldview. To Lewis, this was a grave turning, whereby the seed of relativism planted as settled doctrine was now growing like a weed and choking out the good that may be left. So what can we understand as the good that Lewis was concerned for as being under attack? To understand the difference between classical education and modern education, Lewis has had to point out, as I have tried to do so far, the difference between the classical world and the modern world, i.e. classical culture and modern culture. In the classical view, as taught by ancient thinkers such as Plato, Aristotle, Augustine, the purpose of education was to train children in ordinate affections, or how to order and conform our loves, in Swedenborg's terms. This education primarily involves a rudimentary discipline required to approve and disprove what ought to be accepted and rejected according to an objective set of values, to love the good and eschew the bad. Lewis believed that such values were universal, commonly acknowledged truths, which appear with minor variation across all cultures. He referred to these objective values as the Tao, or the way, and claimed that they were natural principles with a supernatural origin. Lewis recognized that these natural values do not develop automatically or inevitably in children. Thus, they are not natural in that sense of the world, but they must be taught through education. For classical man, the fundamental goal of life was to conform one's soul to the divine meaning and purpose all around him through education of what Burke first called the moral imagination, which the heart owns and the understanding ratifies. This internal effort manifesting in outward behavior is referred to as cosmic piety. This piety has as its basis the a priori assumption that the creative world is filled with divine purpose and meaning, and that exists objectively outside of us, and our piety is our subjective reactions to it. Education in the classical worldview was a nexus between the individual person and those eternal truths inherent in the world. Education was, in effect, a means of enculturating students into the true, the good, and the beautiful through the acquisition of wisdom and virtue. Wisdom was understanding the divine meaning and purpose all around you, and virtue was aligning your love to that divine meaning and purpose so that you love what you ought to love and desire what is truly desirable, and hence experience human flourishing. The preceding, and much of what follows, is, I have to confess, a direct lift from Dr. Stephen Turley's discussion on the abolition of man. But I was so impressed in the manner in which he expressed these ideas that I quoted him here almost verbatim. Classical society recognized the principles of a transcendent moral order. The challenge and purpose of society was to conform to that order in a prudent manner. Lewis observes that in the modern age, there is a presentation of a completely different world. For clarity, we need to define modernity as best as we can. Generally speaking, modernity, and this is taken from the Wikipedia article on the subject, is marked by developments in the late 18th and 19th centuries towards secularization, such as questioning or rejection of tradition, the prioritization of individualism, freedom and formal equality, egalitarianism, faith in inevitable social, scientific, and technological progress, rationalization, and professionalism. According to theologian Thomas C. Oden's perspective, and Oden was a promoter of classical Christianity, modernity is marked by four fundamental values. Moral relativism and situational ethics, which says that what is right is dictated by culture, social location, and situation. Autonomous individualism, which assumes that the moral authority comes essentially from within. Narcissistic hedonism, which focuses on egocentric personal pleasure. And reductive naturalism, which reduces what is reliably known to what one can see, hear, and empirically investigate. If you may recall in my talk, Angels in the Architecture, when I went and talked about theories of neuroscience and the mind-body problem, I did have occasion to speak about all these things in the context of trends in current neuroscience concerning consciousness and the embedded materialism that underscores the modern theories, i.e., that consciousness is just an unintended epiphenomena of biological processing, which itself is just the accidental epiphenomena of physical and chemical laws. So I won't get into that in any more detail, but Lewis observed, and I think correctly, that the modern age was not interested in conforming the soul to the divine meaning and purpose all around us, because in the modern age, as can be inferred by its fundamental values, cited above, we just don't believe there's any divine meaning or purpose. The world is just biological, physical, and chemical causal laws to be understood solely scientifically. Modern materialism asserts as a universal truth, while denying universal truths, that all physical effects have to have a physical cause. A transcendent moral order, or anything transcendent at all, such as Burke's moral imagination, is literal nonsense. There is no divine meaning, there is no purpose behind it all. The world is inherently meaningless and indifferent. If that is the case, then according to modernity, what is the ultimate goal? The ultimate goal, as Turley elucidating Lewis points out, is not to conform or submit my soul to the divine meaning and purpose, or to be educated in that endeavor, The ultimate goal implicit in modernist ideology now is to conform meaningless, purposeless nature to my own desires and my own ambitions. This contrast perhaps best represents the antithesis between classical and modernist worldviews. In the classical world, I submit to conform my desires and ambitions to objective reality around me that is reflective of divine meaning and purpose. While in the modernist worldview, I engage to conform meaningless, purposeless nature to me. The way that meaningless, purposeless nature is conformed to my ambitions is principally through the mechanisms of power and manipulation, namely the institutions that are driven by those mechanisms, science, technology, and the state, and that includes education. Lewis opined that education in that world is divorced from the true, the good, and the beautiful. It cares nothing about wisdom and virtue, sapientia. Now it cares primarily about acquiring information, scientia, useful for the subjugation of nature. Owing to the sovereignty of the individual, embedded in modernist and even more so in postmodernist ideology, whatever meaning you want to give to all those facts is entirely up to you. Turley expounds Lewis's observations and suggests that in such a world, the pursuit of wisdom and virtue is not a feature. The very things that used to define our humanity, wisdom, virtue, truth, goodness, and beauty, have all been cut off. When we consider the shift from classical to modernist and subsequently to the postmodernist age, it was education as enculturation, such as the moral relativism infused in the control of language, that transitioned that stage. Again, the relevance of questions that you are encouraged or even allowed to ask is determined by who answers them. In the classical view, the Tao, or the way that Lewis talks about it, was the motive for education. The motive to educate or lead out was based on the acknowledgement that latent capacity exists in all humans in the faculties of personality and liberty that need to be guided or led in order to develop the embedded spiritual potential by formation of what Burke's moral imagination represented. The Canadian literary critic Northrop Frye and educator, who I have quoted before, takes up the subject of the moral imagination as the educated imagination, confirming that we all have an imagination, which is what distinguishes us in our humanity. Frye indicates that it's this imagination that has produced all culture and civilization. Frye points out that we only have two choices: to be in the possession of an ignorant imagination or an educated one. And the importance of an educated imagination is because it is the only means by which a person is able to discern the difference between the imaginative, which is based in objective reality, and the imaginary, which allows for any kind of fantasy. An educated imagination enables the ability to discern, in spite of the resemblances between vision and hallucination, creativity and neurosis, sense and nonsense. In the modernist, postmodernist view, the Tao is not the motive for education, but the product of education. Lewis states, the conditioner... Oh, did I? Maybe I can go back. I'm always trying to go back. There we go. Lewis states, The conditioners, then, are to choose what kind of artificial Tao they will, for their own good reasons, produce in the human race. They are the motivators. They are the creators of motives. For Lewis, British education was creating a generation of young people cut off from the objective values of the good, the true, and the beautiful, the grist for the imagination, thereby depriving them of the very transcendent means by which their humanity would thrive. We moved from modernism to postmodernism. Postmodernists accept the modernist claim that man is nothing but nature, but reject any universal truth. The casting of man as mere nature is an important shift that has significant consequences, particularly in what is taught and the form that education takes in the postmodernist world. According to modernists, there is no objective reality and thus no objective set of values. I think I could probably click here now. Oh, I'm going back. Sorry. Right. There is no objective set of values. There is no objective natural reality and thus no objective set of values. What we call reality is a conceptual construct, an artifact of scientific practice and language. The postmodern viewpoint, which follows from the rejection of an objective natural reality, is sometimes expressed by the saying that there is no such thing as truth. Reason and logic are merely conceptual constructs. There is no such thing as human nature or a moral imagination consisting of faculties, aptitudes, and dispositions that are in some sense present in human beings at birth. All aspects of human psychology, specifically gender in the current discourse, are completely socially determined. Since there is no objective reality, words can only have a subjective meaning, which arises from a range of contrasts and differences with the meaning of other words. Now, if you compare that, just in the classical view that there was a respect for language as the preservation of meaning, here we have language basically that has a totally subjective use. So the subjectivity of language leads to a rejection of any kind of certainty or grand meta-narratives of human biological, historical, and social development. Modernism, and specifically postmodernism, have done away with the classical notions of humanity, both in regard to the individual and society. Modernity and postmodernism break down human beings as an inexplicable epiphenomena of purposeless nature. In turn, Lewis, basing his view on the premise that man is an image and likeness of God in some way, shape, or form, and that we ought to live striving to reflect that underlying truth, i.e. become the image of Christ, so that we act, live, and breathe, and have our being as God would if he were one of us. We have an inherent ability and thus a responsibility to reflect his sense of truth, his sense of goodness, his sense of beauty. Given that human beings are born as to their interiors so that they cannot die, as Swedenborg teaches, we can be taught to reflect the Lord's moral nature, his epistemological nature, his aesthetic nature. Modernism, of course, rejects all this and asserts that man is simply the product of nature and no less a part of nature than anything else that exists in the natural world. Turley again points out that Lewis recognized, apart from any sense of obligation, social, collective, cultural obligation to be good because it's good to be good, an objective value. Apart from that, all things are power. Something is good because someone had the power to impose it on us. Secularism in the forms of consumerism and constant entertainment was the weak force that was supposed to hold all that together. We could imply some logic and speculate that if the greatest good is to conform meaningless, purposeless nature to my own ambitions and desires, and if man is simply nature, then by definition, it's good to control and manipulate human beings. This comes up actually in the 3rd chapter of The Abolition of Man, which gives a little bit of a sense as to why he chose the title that he did. Man, Lewis recognizes that the negation of the classical ideals in favor of modernism or postmodernist ideology will inevitably generate a class of technocrats, which Lewis calls conditioners. If postmodernists are intent, as I believe they wholly are, to impose a table of values which dismisses the existence of objective values and all classical ideas, then the only way that imposition can be accomplished is through power, in the forms of censorship, the eradication of free expression, coercive indoctrination in right think and wrong think, conditioning under threat of harm for non-compliance. If we look at countries where a forced table of values based on postmodernist ideology are in effect, then this is what we see. North Korea, China, and in some certain areas in the West as well. In the closing chapter of The Abolition of Man, Lewis states, whoops, did I go back again? The man molders of the new age will be armed with the powers of an omnicompetent state and an irresistible scientific technique. We shall get at last a race of conditioners who can really cut out all posterity in what shape they please. This is what education looks like in the postmodernist world. And then the last quote, "It is the magician's bargain. Give up our soul, get power in return. But once our soul, that is ourselves, have been given up, the power thus conferred will not belong to us. We shall in fact be the slaves and puppets of that to which we have given our souls." In the New Church, we are quite familiar with the meta-narrative that the final end and purpose of all creation is a heaven from the human race. As meta-narratives go, that's about as meta as a narrative can be. And since postmodernists reject meta-narratives in general, and this one vehemently in particular, it's obvious that postmodernism doesn't have a future. In the middle of the last century, modernity died. It was based on a method of viewing the world based on intellectual doubt and skepticism, which eventually turned on the very system that created it and killed it. Postmodernism, in a decade or two, will meet the same fate, though its death will probably be significantly more dramatic. Today, the backlash against postmodernism is growing and almost impossible to ignore. I believe we are at a pivotal cusp in our current time, where, partly driven by a growing rejection of postmodernist ideas and practices as they bring about inevitable failures wherever they are applied, there will be a discernible turning back to the ideas of the classical worldview, which is starting to happen now. This turning will be greatly facilitated by education being put back into its proper service. Thanks for listening.